No seat for your son. My sister said it quietly at my father's Children's Foundation Family Day, sliding a plain dinner roll toward my son. 22 other kids had catered plates and named gift bags. Owen had a roll. He pulled it toward himself without a word. I waited for someone to correct her. My father looked at me instead. "She's right," he said. "You never told us he was coming." Owen was already pretending it didn't matter. So was I. My name is Nora Callahan. I look at financial records for a living. 11 years following numbers wherever they lead. I never thought they'd lead me here. 6 months later, I found the Foundation's financial records online. Public information. Anyone could look them up. Children's programs in Lancaster County cut 60%. The director's salary tripled. The director was my sister. If you've ever watched someone take what wasn't theirs and smile while they did it, stay with me. What happened at that gala changed everything my family thought they knew about Renee. I am 38 years old. I live on a narrow street in the southeast corner of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in a white rental house with a front porch and a lilac bush that gets too large every April. My son Owen is 9. He sleeps with the window open even in November. I drive a 2019 Civic with a dent above the left rear wheel that I keep meaning to fix. For 11 years, I have reviewed financial records for individuals, small businesses, and nonprofit organizations. I follow the numbers. I write the reports. I go back to work. My father, Raymond Callahan, started the Lancaster Children's Foundation in 2010. He was 60 years old, recently retired from 31 years of teaching high school music, and he did what certain retired teachers do. He kept going. The foundation ran youth arts and music programs for children in Lancaster County, after-school workshops, summer sessions, Saturday morning classes. He operated it out of a spare bedroom for the first 2 years. He wrote the founding charter by hand on a yellow legal pad, in the careful print of a man who had spent decades writing things on blackboards. I was 23 when he incorporated it. I remember sitting at his kitchen table while he explained what a non-profit charter meant, holding the handwritten pages while he went to get more coffee. He gave me an oak chair the day I moved out of his house 8 months later. He had built it himself from reclaimed wood when I was 12. Ladder back, plain seat, one small gouge on the left rear leg from the time I dragged it across the porch. "You'll want something real," he said, and carried it down the front steps without waiting for me to thank him. I have had it in every place I have lived since. It sits beside my desk now. When things get complicated, I sometimes find myself just looking at it. My sister Renee is 5 years older than me. She has the MBA, the board experience, and the way of carrying herself that makes people assume she is in charge before she opens her mouth. She and her husband Derek live in a new build in Manheim Township, the kind of house that comes with a kitchen renovation and a landscaped front walk already in the listing photos. My father used to say, Renee reminded him of people who get things done. He meant it as a compliment. What I noticed was that Renee had not attended a single one of my father's after-school workshops in the first 15 years of the foundation. Not the spring showcases. Not the Tuesday evening sessions where the children performed for their parents. She donated twice. She came to the annual fundraising dinner when the seating chart placed her near the board table. She called my father every Sunday morning, though, regular as anything. She knew the board members by their first names before my father had introduced her to most of them. When my marriage ended in February of 2022, I moved Owen and me to the east side of Lancaster. My ex-husband and I separated without drama. Owen was 6. He adjusted. He made friends at his new school by the 3rd week. He was fine. What I did not anticipate was that Renee would absorb my divorce as a permanent explanation for whatever she needed to explain about me. "You know how Nora is, since the separation." She said it the way you mentioned weather. I heard it reflected back to me through my father, through family conversations, through the particular quiet that came over certain rooms when I walked in. I stopped expecting it to change. In the fall of 2023, my father's health began to slow. Not dramatically, not at first. More fatigue, small things forgotten. He asked Renee to start attending board meetings because he said he needed someone he trusted to help him keep track of things. She attended 3 meetings. By the 4th, she was running them. In December, he signed paperwork making her executive director of the Lancaster Children's Foundation. He called me to tell me the way you call someone to confirm a decision that is already settled. She has the right background, he said. The board agreed. She'll be good for it. I told him that sounded like the right call. What I noticed was that he had not thought to ask me. I had spent 11 years doing exactly the kind of financial work the foundation required. He did not mention it. Renee moved into the director's office on Prince Street in January of 2024. She redesigned the website. She sent quarterly donor newsletters with her name above the footer my father had written. She hired an administrative assistant and reclassified the salary in a way that changed how the expense line appeared in the annual reports. Small adjustments, the kind that are unremarkable on their own. I was not looking at the foundation's reports. She was my sister, and it was my father's organization, and I had no reason to look. The Foundation Family Day was held on Saturday, April 19th. Owen found the flyer in his backpack on a Tuesday the week before. The Lancaster Children's Foundation Spring Celebration, arts demonstrations, music activities, lunch provided for children. He asked if his grandfather would be there. I told him yes. I did not call ahead to confirm we were coming, because my father's events had never required confirmation before. I did not know there was a list. St. Mary's Fellowship Hall on Rockland Street, round tables with yellow tablecloths, a folding stage in the corner with a keyboard and 2 music stands. At the entrance, a woman sat behind a card table with a printed page, checking names as families arrived. I gave her Owen's full name. She ran her finger down the column once, then again. She looked up with the careful expression people use when they need to say no gently. He's not listed here, she said. I see an Owen Marsh for the Callahan table, but not an Owen Callahan. Owen Marsh was Renee's younger son. He was 8. Owen Callahan was my son. He was 9. I looked past the woman at the door. 22 children were already seated at the tables. Each place had a white catered box and a cloth gift bag tied with a yellow satin ribbon. The name tags on the bags were handwritten. Renee came over from across the room, cream blazer, a lanyard with her name and title in small print, Executive Director. She smiled at the woman behind the table, the way you smile when you are managing a minor inconvenience on someone else's behalf. Well, honestly, we didn't register him, she said. I only ordered for the families who confirmed. There's food in the back for family, though, right? Let me grab something for him. She came back with a dinner roll on a paper plate. She set it down at the edge of the nearest table. Owen looked at the roll. He looked at the catered boxes at the other places. He looked at the gift bags. Then he pulled the roll toward himself with both hands and kept his eyes on the table. I looked for my father across the room. He was talking to Martin Bauer near the stage. Martin had been on the foundation board since the first year, had known Raymond for 30 years. My father caught my eye and made his way over. He put his hand on Owen's shoulder briefly, then he looked at me. She's right, he said. You never told us he was coming. I did not say anything. Owen was still looking at the table. Across the room, 22 children were opening their gift bags. We stayed 40 minutes. Owen asked once, quietly, if he could go look at the keyboard. I said yes. I watched him walk across the room alone and press one key with one finger. He held it and listened to the note. He pressed it again. Then he walked back and sat down in front of his roll. We left at 1:45. Owen fell asleep in the back seat before we reached the highway. I drove home in the particular silence that follows something you cannot fix with an explanation. I put him to bed at 7:30. He came out of his room at 8:47 and found me at the kitchen table. He stood in the doorway in his soccer jersey, the number 4 on the back, and he looked at me the way he does before he asks something he has been sitting with for a while. Mom, he said, did I do something wrong? Not a question. The thing a 9-year-old says when he has been trying to make sense of something for hours and cannot. No, I told him, you did nothing wrong. He looked at me a moment longer, then he nodded and went back to bed. I sat at the table for a long time after that, The oak chair was beside my desk in the next room. I could see it from where I was sitting. My father had built it 30 years ago and given it to me because he thought I would want something real. I had always understood that as his way of saying he knew me. After a while, I went to my desk, opened my laptop, and searched for the foundation's name in the government's public database for nonprofit organizations. The most recent annual financial filing was available for anyone to download. It had been there for months. I downloaded it and opened it. The morning of April 20th, 7/12. What I noticed was this: the program's expense line had dropped by 60% in 18 months. The prior year report showed $312,000 directed to children's programming, arts workshops, music instruction, after-school sessions. The current filing showed $127,000. The difference had not gone to overhead or facility costs or materials. It had moved to salary and administrative expenses. The director's compensation had tripled in 14 months. The director was my sister. I sat with that for a moment. Not the anger, not yet, something quieter. The specific feeling of recognizing a pattern you have read before in other people's files, redirected now at your own family. I thought about what my father had said at the fellowship hall. She's right. You never told us he was coming. He had believed Renee's account, the way he had believed her account of my divorce, her account of my reliability, her version of who I was and wasn't. He had believed it because she had been building that version steadily for years, and she had started building it before I had any reason to watch. I thought about Owen pulling that roll toward himself with both hands. I got up from the desk and looked at the oak chair for a moment. My father had made it by hand. He had given it to me because he thought I would need something real to hold on to. I did not know yet what he had understood about either of us. I sat back down. I had two options. I could put the report away and keep the peace and wait for whatever came next, the way things spiral when no one deals with them directly. Or I could look at what I had found, the way I had been trained to look at things, and go where the numbers led. I was someone who read financial records for a living. I had done it for 11 years. I had never once found an innocent explanation for a pattern like this. Noted, I said to no one. And I opened the prior year filing. It took me 3 weeks to verify what I was seeing. The first thing I did was pull every annual report the foundation had filed, going back to 2010. They were all public record, downloadable in under a minute. I went year by year. Programming expenses were stable from 2010 through 2022. A modest dip in the year Renee joined the board as an observer. A steeper reduction in the year she became director. Then, the figure I had already seen. $127,000 to children's programs in the most recent fiscal year, $312,000 the year before she took over, 60%. I verified the salary figures over 2 evenings. There was no ambiguity. The director's total compensation in the most recent year was 3 times what the previous director had received over the last of her 8 years in the role. I did the arithmetic. I wrote it down on a legal pad. I wrote it down again. The annual report showed aggregate expense figures, not individual transactions. I could see that the administrative line had grown. What I could not see yet was where the money had gone, transfer by transfer. For that, I needed the detailed records. Over the following weeks, I filed 2 formal requests for financial documentation with the foundation's registered agent. Both came back partial. What I noticed was a consistent pattern in what was provided and what was not. The records showing general salary and facility costs were included. The records showing smaller individual transfers were not. While I was waiting for the second records response, I went back to my father's desk. He had given me access to his filing cabinet years ago when he first started having health problems and needed someone he trusted to know where things were. In the bottom drawer, in a manila folder labeled simply Foundation, was the original founding charter. The yellow legal pad pages, the ones he had written by hand, photocopied and hole-punched. I read the stated purpose of the organization as he had written it in 2010, to support the educational and artistic development of children in Lancaster County through accessible, community-based programs in music, visual arts, and performance. 12 words into it, and it was already the opposite of what the current numbers showed. I set it on the desk and took a photograph of the first page on my phone. I called Martin Bauer on May 8th at 10:30 in the morning. He was 67, retired from commercial real estate, a founding board member who had helped Raymond carry folding chairs into St. Mary's for the first community meeting in 2010. I had met him a handful of times at foundation events over the years. He wore a sport coat to a coffee shop. He was someone who had known my father for 30 years. I asked if I could buy him coffee on Queen Street. He said yes. I brought 2 pages. The program expense comparison across 4 fiscal years, the salary figures. I set them on the table between us and let him read. "How did you get these?" he said. I told him they were public filings. I told him anyone could download them from the government's nonprofit database. I told him I had. He read the pages a second time without speaking. He set them down and looked at the street through the window. "What is it you're asking me to do?" he said. I told him I was not asking him to do anything yet. I was asking him to look at the numbers and tell me whether I was reading them correctly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're reading them correctly." He picked up the pages again and looked at the salary column a second time. Then he set them down with the careful deliberateness of a man who has spent a career making decisions he cannot take back. "She told me the administrative costs had gone up because of compliance," he said. "She said the regulatory environment had changed." I asked him when she had told him that. 6 months ago, he said, at the fall donor meeting. I remember thinking the number was high, but she had an explanation ready. He looked at the window again. When he spoke, it was quieter. "Raymond trusted her," he said. "He told the board she had a strong background." "I know," I told him. He told me the same thing. On May 23rd, I filed a 3rd records request, this time with Bauer's signature attached as a sitting board member. The response came back on June 11th. 37 separate transfers, each one under $10,000. Transferred from the Foundation's program fund to a separate administrative account between January 2024 and March 2025. Total, $143,900. I spent 3 evenings going through them individually. I printed the list and laid it across my kitchen table. 37 rows, dates, amounts, the account number, the money moved to. The amounts range from $4,800 to $9,700. None of them crossed $10,000. I had seen this pattern before in other clients' files, the careful spacing, the amounts that stayed just under the threshold. It was not accidental. It was someone who knew exactly where the line was. What I noticed was that the transfers clustered in 2 periods, 11 in the first quarter of 2024, then a pause, then 26 more between August and March. The pause corresponded to the period when the board had requested a mid-year financial update. Whoever had structured the transfers had been watching the calendar. 37 transfers, each one sized to stay beneath the internal reporting threshold that would have required additional board review. All of them inside the window of Renee's directorship. Bauer called me on July 3rd at 6:15 in the evening. He said Renee had been making inquiries. She had called 2 board members asking who had been requesting foundation records. She had not called me. He asked what I planned to do. I told him I had not decided yet. I had, though. I had decided on the morning of April 20th, sitting at my desk while Owen was still asleep, looking at numbers that told a story my father had not been able to read. I had been waiting for the right room. If you have been following this and you are wondering how long a person can carry something like this without breaking, stay with me. Because what I did next, I did not do out of rage. I did it because I had spent 11 years learning to read what the numbers actually said. And I had a room. By July, I had 3 printed copies of the documentation. Each copy divided into 3 tabbed sections. The program expense comparison across 4 years, the salary figures, and the 37 transfer records with dates and amounts. I kept 1 copy at my desk, 1 in my car, 1 I gave to Patrice. Patrice Odom is my colleague. We have worked together for 4 years. She reviews financial records with the same care I do and does not say more than she needs to. I set the documentation on her desk on July 16th. She read it in 11 minutes without speaking. Then she set it down. "How long has this been going on?" she said. 14 months confirmed, I told her. She nodded, the way she does when she is processing something and has not yet decided how to say it. Then she looked at me. "You have everything you need," she said. "I know," I told her. She was quiet for another moment. Then, "Is there a room?" I told her there was going to be one in October. She looked at me steadily. I had known Patrice long enough to read what she was not saying. She was not asking whether the documentation was solid. She was asking whether I was. Whether I could walk into that room and read those numbers in front of people who had trusted my sister and my father and do it without my voice changing. I told her I had been reading numbers out loud in front of people for 11 years. She nodded once. "That's what I thought," she said, and went back to her own files. On July 22nd, an envelope arrived at my house in Renee's handwriting. I stood in the kitchen and held it for a moment before opening it. Inside was an invitation to the Lancaster Children's Foundation Annual Gala, October 17th, Hotel Lancaster Grand Ballroom. 45 donors expected. 8 board members confirmed. At the bottom, below the printed event details, Renee had written in pen, "I thought you'd want to come. For Dad." The gala would be the first major foundation event since Raymond's passing. Renee had framed it as a tribute. She would speak. The full board would be present. 2 local journalists had confirmed seats. I set the invitation on my desk beside the oak chair. I sent my confirmation through the foundation's website the same afternoon. The weeks between July and October had a particular texture. I went to work. I reviewed other clients' records. I picked Owen up from school. I made dinner. I sat at my desk in the evenings sometimes and looked at the documentation without opening it. The folder did not need to be opened again. I had memorized every figure in it by the second week of June. What I was doing in those quiet evenings was something else. I was learning what it felt like to carry a true thing in a room where everyone else believed a different story. I was learning to be patient with that. Carol left soup on my porch one evening in September, a container of chicken and rice with a sticky note that said only, "Tuesday, if you want to talk." I did not call, but I kept the note on my refrigerator. Raymond called me on July 11th at 9:23 in the evening. I had not told him what I was doing. I had not mentioned the records requests, or the conversations with Bauer, or the documentation I had been building since April. I did not know who had told him. I assumed Bauer, or one of the other board members. My father was still a founding member. He had the right to know. "Nora," he said, "I trusted your sister with this. Don't do this." I was quiet. Outside the window, the street was empty. Owen was asleep down the hall. "And you know me," I said. He did not answer. There was a pause. Then the line went quiet. I sat with the phone in my hand. What I noticed was that I had been waiting for that call longer than I understood, waiting for him to say something that confirmed what I had been slowly accepting for years, that my father had never quite seen me. He had seen Renee's credentials, her board profile, her way of arriving. He had not seen me standing in the same room. I had spent 3 months building a case using the exact skills of the work I did every day, work he had never once thought to ask me to do for him. The call lasted 47 seconds. I set the phone on the counter and went to check on Owen. He was asleep on his side, the small red harmonica case on the shelf above his bed, the one Raymond had given him the previous spring. I stood in the doorway of his room for a moment. He was breathing the slow, even breath of someone who had decided, hours ago, that the day was finished. I thought about the roll on the paper plate. I thought about the keyboard key he had pressed twice, alone, and listened to. I thought about my father's hand on Owen's shoulder for exactly 1 moment before he turned to me and told me I was the problem. I went back to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water and stood at the counter and drank it. Then, I opened the documentation folder and confirmed, for no reason except that I needed to do something with my hands, that every figure was exactly as I had written it. They were. Raymond died on September 3rd, 2025, at 6:22 in the morning at Lancaster General Hospital. He had been declining through August. The hospice team had been in the house since the middle of the month. I had been at the hospital through the night. There were 4 other people in the room when he died: 2 nurses, a hospice aide, and a man named Gerald, who had been Raymond's oldest friend and had driven in from Reading the night before. I held my father's hand. He was not conscious. I told him I was there. I do not know whether he heard me. Renee arrived at the hospital at 10:47. She came in with Derek and her older son. She looked at me across the room and her face did the thing it does. The composed grief of someone who had prepared for this. She said, "I got here as fast as I could." I nodded. I did not say anything about where I had been since 4 in the morning. I brought the oak chair home that afternoon. I carried it out of his house myself and put it in the back of my Civic, the way he had put it in my first car 16 years before. I drove home through the September morning with the chair in the back seat and my father's house behind me. I set the chair beside my desk in the same place it had always been. I had the gala in 6 weeks. I want to stop here for a moment, because I know how this story sounds. The easy version of it is that I was right and she was wrong, and I held on long enough for things to come out. But what I lost in those months was not something I got back at the gala. My father died believing I was the one creating the problem. He never knew what I had found. He never had the chance to understand that the daughter he had not quite seen had spent 3 months doing exactly the kind of work he had always needed done. I carry that. I am not going to pretend otherwise. If you have ever sat with that kind of loss, stay with me. Because what I did in that ballroom, I did not do for myself. The Foundation Annual Gala was held on October 17th at the Hotel Lancaster Grand Ballroom, 6:30 in the evening, long tables in white linen. At the building's entrance, framed photographs of Foundation programs lined both sides of the hallway. Children at music workshops, a classroom with instruments on every desk. One photograph of Raymond standing at a whiteboard, younger than I had known him, the year the Foundation incorporated. Beside it, a small placard, in memory of Raymond Callahan, founder. I arrived at 6:15. I sat in the 3rd row of the center chair section, not at one of the donor tables. I had dressed plainly. The canvas tote was under my chair with 3 tabbed copies of the documentation inside. I set my phone on silent and put it in my coat pocket. Martin Bauer was in the front row. He had arrived before me. He did not look back when I came in. The room filled steadily. 45 donors. 8 board members at their assigned table along the front. The 2 journalists from the local paper sat along the wall with their press badges. I recognized Renee's husband Derek near the back with their older son. I did not see anyone else from my father's side except Bauer. Renee came to the podium at 7:41. She wore a navy dress. Her hair was in the careful arrangement she always kept. She had notes on the lectern. She spoke for 7 minutes. She talked about Raymond's vision for Lancaster's children. She talked about his belief in what music and art could do for a young person who had been told there was nothing for them. She used the word legacy 4 times. She used the word family twice. She said the foundation had grown and matured and found its footing. She ended with, "Raymond built something that will outlast all of us. And tonight, I can tell you with confidence that this foundation is in good hands." She paused. The room held its breath before applause. I stood up. I did not raise my hand. I did not wait to be recognized. I stepped out of the row with the canvas tote and walked to the open space between the seating and the board table, about 8 feet from where Renee was standing. She looked at me. "Renee," I said. The room went quiet, not the quiet after applause, the other kind. I set the 3 copies of the documentation on the edge of the nearest board table. I took 1 copy, opened it to the first tab, and I read in the same level voice I use when I deliver a findings report. "I want to read some numbers," I said. "These come from the Foundation's public financial filings. Anyone in this room can pull them up tonight on a phone." 3 years ago, the Lancaster Children's Foundation directed $312,000 to direct children's programming, arts workshops, music instruction, after-school sessions across Lancaster County. 41 active program sites serving children in this community. Children who showed up on Saturdays and after school because someone told them there was a place for them. Last fiscal year, that number was $127,000, a reduction of 60%. The foundation currently funds 11 program sites. It funded 41 3 years ago. 30 program sites that existed under Raymond's leadership no longer exist under hers. I turned to the second tab. In the same period, the foundation's administrative salary expenses increased from $68,000 annually to $204,000 annually. The director's personal compensation tripled. That is not a rounding error. That is not a regulatory adjustment. The year-over-year figures are on the page in front of each board member. I have an additional copy for each of the journalists present. I set that copy down and took the third. Between January 2024 and March 2025, 37 separate transfers were made from this foundation's program fund into a separate administrative account. Each transfer was structured to stay under $10,000. Each one was authorized by the executive director. The combined total of those 37 transfers is $143,900. $143,900 that Raymond Callahan raised from this community, from the people in this room, for the children of Lancaster County. I closed the folder. I looked at Renee. She was still at the lectern. One hand was on its edge. She had not moved. "You told my son there was nothing for him at your table," I said. "I spent 3 months learning that you have been saying the same thing to every child in this county." The room was silent. Martin Bauer stood. He did not look at me. He looked at Renee. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Renee, he said. Board meeting, all members. He sat back down. No one applauded. No one spoke. I picked up the tote bag and walked toward the exit. The hallway photographs were the same ones I had passed on the way in. At the far end near the door, a single framed photograph. Raymond, standing in the doorway of his house on Fruitville Pike, the oak tree in the yard behind him, squinting into the sun. He looked like himself. He looked like the man who had carried a chair down a flight of front steps because he thought his younger daughter might need something real. I stopped in front of it for 2 seconds. Then I walked through the door. I called Carol from the parking garage. She picked up on the second ring. "How did it go?" she said. "I'm coming to get him," I said. "He's fine," Carol said. "He made a friend." I stood in the parking garage with my phone against my ear. Somewhere above me in the hotel, 45 donors and 8 board members were sitting in a ballroom with 3 copies of a public document. Outside, I could hear traffic on Prince Street. I got in my car and drove. The board meeting on October 18th lasted 4 hours. I was not present. Martin Bauer called me at 2 in the afternoon. The vote was 5-1 to suspend Renee as executive director, effective immediately, pending an independent financial review. The single dissenting vote came from an associate board member who was Derek's sister. An independent auditor was engaged the following week. I do not know what Renee said to the board that morning. I have not spoken to her since I said her name in that ballroom. My father's founding charter, the one he had written by hand on a yellow legal pad in 2010, was submitted to the auditor as a primary governance document. It described clearly what the organization was for: children, arts and music, Lancaster County. It was exactly what he had said it was from the beginning, in exactly the careful print of a man who had spent 30 years writing things on blackboards. In the weeks that followed, the board voted to restore program funding to close to historical levels, using a combination of donor bridge grants and administrative restructuring. The process took several months. It was not clean or simple. Programs that had been reduced would need time to rebuild fully. I want to be honest about that. The money that left did not come back overnight. Some of the instructors who had been let go when the program sites closed had taken other positions and could not return immediately. The after-school sessions on Vine Street did not reopen until February. The Saturday morning workshops on Rockland Street reopened in mid-March. There were 11 children at the first session. By the fourth week, there were 26. The auditor's full report was submitted to the board in January. I did not read it in its entirety, though I could have. I had already read everything it would contain. What I understand is that the findings confirmed what the transfers showed, and that the matter was referred to the county district attorney's office. I do not know what will follow from that. That part of the story belongs to a process that moves on its own timeline, and I have learned not to wait for it. My father left me the oak chair and a letter. The letter was short. He had written it in August, when he still could. He said he knew things had not always been easy between us. He said he thought I had always been more capable than I had been given the chance to show. He said he hoped I was being good to myself. He did not mention Renee. He did not mention the foundation. He signed it Raymond, not Dad. I read the letter at my desk. The oak chair was beside me. I have not moved it since. Owen turned 10 in February. He had known in the way children know things that something serious had happened at the Gala that October night. He had been at Carol's, watching a movie, and Carol had told me later that he had not asked her many questions when I called. That was how Owen handled things he was not ready to ask about yet. He filed them and waited. He came to find me in December while I was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. He stood in the doorway in his soccer jersey, number 4 on the back, and he looked at me the way he does before he asks something he has been turning over for a while. "Is Grandpa's foundation going to be okay?" he said. "It's going to take work and some time," I told him. "But the people who started it still believe in what it's for." He thought about that for a moment. "Good," he said, and went back to his book. On March 7th, 2026, at 10:15 in the morning, I drove Owen to his first Saturday session at the Lancaster Youth Arts and Music Program, which had resumed operations 3 weeks earlier at a community center on Rockland Street, 3 blocks from St. Mary's. He had signed up for the keyboard workshop. He was 10 years and 2 weeks old. I walked him to the door. He went in without looking back. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a while. I thought about the afternoon 15 years ago when my father sat at his kitchen table and explained what a nonprofit charter meant, holding the handwritten pages while he went to get more coffee. I thought about how certain I had been, at 23, that he saw me the way I needed him to. I know now that he did the best he could with what he understood. I know that is not the same as being seen. I know both of those things are true at the same time. I'm still learning to hold them together. There is something I want you to take from this, if you are willing. Not the part about standing up in the ballroom. That part was specific to what I knew and what I had spent 3 months preparing. The thing I want you to carry is simpler. You do not need a lawyer or a miracle or a perfect moment. You need to know where to look, and you need the patience to wait until the room is quiet enough for people to hear you. The Lancaster Children's Foundation is still running. Owen came out to the parking lot after his session with a paper flyer about a spring showcase. "Mom," he said, "they said I can keep coming." "I know," I told him. "I know you can." What finished it for me, what made the whole thing finally settle, was not the vote or the documents or the gala. It was understanding that the numbers my father had trusted told him one story about our family, and that there had always been another set of numbers, right there in a public file, that told a different one. Anyone could have looked them up. I just happened to be the one who knew how.